Welcome back to Killer Stories. I'm your host, Bobby Holmes. This week, I'm covering the case of Alice Trappler, suggested by Samantha Crane. Samantha has sent me suggestions in the past. I think it was Eric Smith. So I just wanted to give you a big thanks for tuning in each week and being such an engaging listener. This case was covered on Oxygen Snapped, Season 12, Episode 3, which was the primary source used in my research. Alice Trappler was born in the Philadelphia area of Pennsylvania. Her family relocated to the small town of Addison, New York, where she lived throughout her childhood. Her family had a farm, and she was a country girl through and through. She was somewhat of a tomboy. After graduating from college, Alice moved to Texas. She got a job working construction, but before too long, she moved back to Philadelphia, where she did landscaping. You can tell by the type of work Alice chose, she was a hard worker. She wasn't much of a girly girl. Growing up on a farm made her a little rough around the edges. While living in Philadelphia, she drove home most weekends to visit her family in Addison, New York. It was a 4-hour drive each way. Back in Addison, Alice's parents hired a farm hand to help their son. It was 23-year-old Thomas Wesley Borden, who went by Wes. Wes was a decent guy, just had somewhat of a reputation with the local police. He dropped out of school in the 9th grade and was arrested a couple of times for petty theft, like shoplifting a candy bar or a pack of cigarettes. When Alice was home for a visit, Wes worked up the courage to ask her out on a date. She was a bit older at 29, but that didn't seem to matter. After just 6 months of dating, they were engaged to be married. Wes had 2 little girls with an ex-girlfriend. Alice loved being their stepmom. Wes and his daughters moved to Philadelphia to live with her. But it didn't take long for their marriage to enter a downward spiral. Apparently, Wes would just take off without notice for days at a time, leaving Alice alone to care for his girls. She wasn't one to be taken advantage of. In fact, Alice liked being the one in control. After 4 years, the couple divorced. I don't believe that Alice ever legally adopted Wes's girls, but after the divorce, she took him to court for shared custody. Alice felt like she basically raised them the past 4 years and deserved to remain in their lives. The court battle lasted 3 years. In the end, the children were to live with Wes's parents, and Alice was allowed visitation. She left Philadelphia and bought property back in Addison, New York. This is where Wes's parents lived, and she wanted to be closer to the girls. The property had land and space for her to have farm animals, just like her childhood home. She went back to working construction. At this point, Alice was 37 years old and apparently a cougar. Not that there's anything wrong with that. She met her next man online, 29-year-old Dan Bennett. Dan was a country boy just like Alice. He too had a few run-ins with the local police, mostly due to his bad temper that led to bar fights after a night of drinking. She had a thing for bad boys. They were together for just 3 months when Alice found out she was pregnant. She was so excited because she loved being the mother figure for Wes's girls. Now she was going to have her own biological child. Dan was equally excited to become a father. He moved in with Alice, and they daydreamed about their future family. But the truth was, they barely knew each other. They were butting heads left and right. Both Alice and Dan liked to be in control and argued constantly. 3 months into cohabitating, their relationship was over. But with a baby on the way, the breakup wasn't that simple. Dan moved out and temporarily moved in with his father in Beaver Dams, New York, about 25 miles away. He made it clear to her that even though their relationship was over, he still planned on being there for their child. But Alice didn't want that. After going through a lengthy custody battle with Wes and ending with only visitation rights, she didn't want to share her baby girl with Dan. He was always texting and asking to come along to her OB appointments. Alice either flat out ignored Dan or responded with the nasty messages. She didn't even inform him when she went into labor. That makes me so sad to know that he missed the birth of his daughter because Alice was being selfish. He only found out that Alice had the baby through the grapevine of mutual friends. He was heartbroken. When he contacted Alice asking to see the baby, she refused. But as the biological father, Dan had every right to see his daughter. Oddly enough, Alice contacted Dan's father, Frank, and invited him over to see the baby. Frank pleaded with her to allow Dan in their baby's life. Alice's response: "He will never lay eyes on this baby." Dan had no choice but to take legal action, but we all know how long that can take. Over 5 months had passed before a court date was finally scheduled, but the night before the hearing, Dan Bennett was murdered. Someone walked into the front door of Frank Bennett's home and found Dan sleeping on the couch. They pointed a 12-gauge shotgun to his head and pulled the trigger. Frank was in the basement and heard the front door open, a few footsteps, and then bang. He flew up the stairs, but whoever shot Dan was gone. If you know how a shotgun works, it's a bunch of pellets exploding versus a single bullet. You can imagine the horrific scene Frank stumbled upon. His son's body on the couch and his head was basically blown off. Even though it was obvious Dan was deceased, Frank immediately called 911. When police arrived, they ruled out a burglary. Nothing was missing, and Frank heard maybe 3 steps taken before the gun was fired. This was clearly an execution. They asked if he had any idea who could be responsible. Frank said that Dan had a few scuffles at the bar, creating some local enemies, but couldn't imagine murder as retaliation. He told police Dan was supposed to be in court the next day for a custody hearing against his ex-girlfriend, Alice Trappler. The fact that this happened literally the night before he was to appear in court was very suspicious. Early the next morning, police went to talk to Alice. They told her that Dan was dead, and she barely showed any emotion. Learning of the tragedy had no effect on her, but once they started interviewing Alice, she became very defensive. She said that Dan regularly used drugs and physically assaulted her, which was the reason she didn't want him in her daughter's life. They asked where she was the night before. She reported being at her mom's house all night, and her mother, Wilma, confirmed her alibi. Cell phone records back that up. She was at her mother's, which was about 30 to 40 minutes away from Frank Bennett's home. Investigators followed up with those who were known to have beef with Dan. They all had a similar response. They didn't like Dan, maybe even hated him, but would never go as far as killing him. They were hitting a dead end as far as suspects. The same day that Dan was murdered, a neighbor discovered a live, unfired round for a 12-gauge shotgun on the ground near her mailbox. This was the country, and people hunted and shot target practice regularly. However, knowing what just happened a few hours earlier, she called it into the police. And good thing she did, because this ammo would help investigators find their killer. They found multiple shells in the surrounding area that matched the one fired at Dan Bennett. Investigators went to work researching this particular ammo and to see if any had been purchased in the area recently. Bingo! Just 4 hours before the murder, someone purchased these exact same shells at the local Walmart. Luckily, Walmart is loaded with cameras and was able to see the person purchasing the ammo and walking to his vehicle. They didn't even need to run the plates because an officer recognized the man on the footage. It was Alice's ex-husband, Wes Borden. What the actual hell? This woman goes through a lengthy custody battle with this guy, and here he is buying the ammo that killed her baby daddy. As it turns out, Alice and Wes had rekindled their relationship. When an investigator tried to reach Wes for questioning, they realized he skipped town. He answered his phone, obviously not understanding how GPS tracking works, and said unless he was under arrest, he was not coming in for questioning. A few days later, at 1 a.m., Wes called the investigator back, sounding very distressed. They asked him when he would be back in town, and he said, probably never. They asked what he meant by that, to which he responded, I'm just going to get a bullet, and ended the phone call. His phone was pinging off a tower in Philadelphia. The Addison police called the Philly police to try to track Wes down. An officer identified Wes's truck and license plate, got behind him, and turned his lights on. Wes initially tried to get away. Once he realized that wasn't happening, he pulled over, jumped out of his truck, and ran towards the railroad tracks. An officer caught up to him on foot, but Wes lied about his name and dodged him, continuing his attempt to escape. He ran towards the tracks, seeing a train approaching. He stopped, looked back at the officer chasing him, then turned around and jumped right into the oncoming train. He died instantly on impact. Wes did not admit to being the one who killed Dan Bennett, but his guilt that led to suicide speaks louder than words. Their only suspect was gone, making closing this murder case that much harder. Wes had recently moved in with his stepbrother Nathan Han. To try to get some answers, they brought Nathan in for questioning. Nathan told police that Wes never got over his divorce from Alice. When he heard she broke things off with Dan, he pursued her. Were the feelings really mutual, or was Alice using Wes to get back at Dan? According to Nathan, the night of Dan's murder, Wes said, "Come on, we need to take care of Dan." The conversation led him to believe they were going to go beat him up, try and scare him into backing out of the custody hearing. The two dressed in camo pants, black shirts, and black bandanas over their face. While driving to Frank Bennett's home, Wes turned to Nathan and told him they were going to kill Dan. Nathan was shocked. He didn't know what to do at this point, so he just went along with it. They pulled up to Frank's house. Wes grabs a 12-gauge Winchester shotgun from behind his seat. Wes and Nathan both got out of the truck and walked up to the front door. Wes opened the door. Nathan flipped on the lights. Dan was sleeping on the couch but woke up from the flash of the lights. He started to lift his head when Wes pulled the trigger, leaving the spent shell at the scene. They both ran back to the truck and peeled out. What they did next was pretty dumb. While driving away, they ditched the rest of the live rounds out the window, which were later recovered by police and used to identify Wes as the one who purchased them. They drove to Pinnacle State Park and buried the gun. Police were able to recover the murder weapon thanks to Nathan's cooperation. He told investigators that Alice gave Wes a gun to use. The two had been texting back and forth all night. Even though Nathan cooperated and helped tremendously with this case, he was still arrested for the murder of Dan Bennett. He wasn't the only one. Phone records showing the text conversations that night led to Alice Trappler's arrest as well. Alice. He still lives on Pearl Street. Wes. Okay, can you bring that thing you offered me and I'll stop and get it? I'm here. Hey, unless you have another one of these, get rid of that box. Alice. Wonder if he will show up for court today. LOL. Wes was the one to pull the trigger, but Alice was the one who manipulated him into committing murder for her. Nathan made a plea deal. He pled guilty to manslaughter in the first degree and was sentenced to 19 years in prison. Alice, if convicted, could end up with a life sentence. Another ex-boyfriend testified in court that he gave a gun to Alice. She told him she needed one for protection on her farm. Someone had filed the serial number off of the murder weapon, but it was the same gauge, make, and model as the one that her ex-boyfriend Brett had given her. That, paired with the testimony from Nathan that Alice gave Wes the gun, plus the text messages the day of the murder, it was pretty strong evidence pointing to Alice Trappler. Alice's defense team said that Wes acted alone in this murder in an attempt to win her back. Luckily, the jury saw right through her bullshit testimony and after just 4 hours of deliberation, came back with a guilty verdict. She was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. She will be eligible for parole in 2037. And that's the story of Daniel Bennett, father who was denied the opportunity to even meet his baby girl and murdered at the hands of ex-girlfriend Alice Trappler. Let's not forget the tragedy of Wes Borden. He was manipulated by Alice, and the guilt of what he did led to suicide. I realize we should be held accountable for the choices we make. It was obviously wrong for Wes to kill Dan, but I think he had instant regret and guilt for what he did. People do crazy things for love. Let's do a few listener shoutouts. Apple user ZZMMM Dirt Farmer gave me 5 stars saying, "Best podcast ever, great content and best presentation ever." Amelia McCollum gave 5 stars titled, "My favorite." Bobby's stories are well researched and she is a joy to listen to. This is by far my favorite true crime podcast. I've listened to every episode and look forward to new ones every week. Thanks so much to my return listeners. I appreciate you more than you know. If you would like to support the show, you can visit buymeacoffee.com/killerstories to give a one-time donation. Or if you click my link tree in the show notes, you can access my Killer Stories merchandise through Freedom Street Boutique. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at Killer Stories Podcast, and I'm on Twitter at Killer Stories PC. You can continue to email me any story suggestions, killerstoriespodcast@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, this has been a Killer Story.